It's a great story in that this individual seems to be incredibly meticulous in the way that he was a basically planner, and he didn't leave much to chance, and he was a great leader and very detail-oriented individual coming back from, I guess, a fight, and in the way, due to the darkness or whatever it was, his own cavalry didn't recognize him, and they called out, "Who goes there?" He responded. They said that it's a trick, that basically thought it was a Yankee, that he was part of the Confederates, and they shot him. His hand got amputated, and a couple of weeks later, he died as a result of that wound of a friendly fire. And, the way I phrased it was worst authentication ever, in that, this individual, known leader and well-respected and being detail-oriented, couldn't authenticate himself to his own troops using his voice, his face, or any passcode or known key to basically authenticate and inform them that he is who he claims to be.
Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show. Welcome back, everybody. This is Bill Murphy, your host for the Red Zone podcast. Today, I had a wonderful conversation with Keyvan Alakani, who is the Senior Director of Technology at RSA. And you're in for a real treat today because we talked about authentication from the past and also deep into the future. And from the past, I mean, we started out with Andrew Jackson in the Civil War, in the China Qin dynasty from 200 BC. We talked about the development of authentication from the past, but more importantly, started to talk about how it's impacting in the future. So things that you're going to want to learn about are iris scanning, selfie-based authentication, voice, fingerprint, face recognition, gesture recognition, and other trends in mobile security. So I think that's enough to jump into this. And it's a pretty dense interview and a lot of fun. And you're going to have some major takeaways just from a learning and aha moments to start to understand where the industry is going from server-based authentication to device-based authentication. That's the real key. So with that, let's jump into the show, and please leave any comments that are positive about the show in iTunes. It really helps the show gain velocity and have other IT decision makers and other security professionals find the show and learn and spread the message from these great experts that are coming on to share their wisdom. Have a great day, everybody, and let's move on to the show. Welcome, Keyvan, to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
So let's talk about user authentication. This is one of my favorite areas because in working with CIOs and doing assessments for years now, one of the key pieces that my team and I always look at is authentication. And I love the points you made in the presentation that I just recently saw that you gave at RSA. And you had an interesting story that you talked about Stonewall Jackson at the beginning of your presentation. And if you could take a moment to explain that, I think it's a great story, and I don't think many people know it. Do you mind starting and just tell everybody what that story is?
It's a great story in that this individual seems to be incredibly meticulous in the way that he was a basically planner, and he didn't leave much to chance, and he was a great leader and very detail-oriented individual coming back from, I guess, a fight, and in the way, due to the darkness or whatever it was, his own cavalry didn't recognize him, and they called out, "Who goes there?" He responded. They said that it's a trick, that basically thought it was a Yankee, that he was part of the Confederates, and they shot him. His hand got amputated, and a couple of weeks later, he died as a result of that wound of a friendly fire. And, the way I phrased it was worst authentication ever, in that, this individual, known leader and well-respected and being detail-oriented, couldn't authenticate himself to his own troops using his voice, his face, or any passcode or known key to basically authenticate and inform them that he is who he claims to be.
That is interesting now, and I was curious, how important do you feel authentication is for security moving forward?
It's interesting you bring up this question. At the same conference, I was at a roundtable with a group of companies, primarily in the financial industry, but also security companies. And it was kind of a birds of a feather, and the topic we were assigned to was client authentication, client-side authentication. And sure enough, as soon as they saw my badge with RSA, they started asking questions about our web threat detection products, the ones that kind of sit in the back end and monitor and look at events and threats. And I said, guys, this table's topic is client authentication. Can we come back to the topic? And they reminded me that well over 90% of the threats that they identify, the root cause of those threats end up being client authentication misuse, where the user has somebody else's password, or it was a weak password, they were able to get it, credentials were compromised, and that represents such a huge majority of those types of threats that get detected that it's basically overwhelmingly pointing to the same root cause, in that the expectation from the industry is really for companies like RSA, similar companies, to really connect the dots. From that web threat detection, from the breaches, from the hacks, we find that at the center of a lot of them was some credential that had been compromised or shared or overlooked or keylogged or phished. And as a result of that, I think it's critical that we address it in light of waking up every day and finding that there's yet another site that's been hacked and a large number of user credentials have been compromised or identity information that's been stolen.
So you're saying that 90% of these hacks are coming from the client, these mobile client, or any type of client?
Any device, yeah. So basically, device independent, saying that the compromise, root cause of the threat that was detected for the compromise ends up being some vulnerability and some compromise of a user's credentials, an administrator's credentials, a highly privileged user's credentials. So client authentication essentially played a big role in, or poorly implemented or poorly enforced client authentication ends up being at the root of a lot of those threats.
So what I've listened to you talk about is mobile authentication. Is it fair to break out authentication against for example, a directory of a company versus authentication to a website for banking? Do you divide those into two separate worlds, or are you prefer to talk about authentication from holistically?
No, that's a good point. I mean, we are seeing that well over 50% of larger organizations have, in fact, taken the time and money and resources to implement two-factor or better authentication, strong authentication, take a stronger look at how their employees, contractors, consultants interact with their corporate networks and systems. But when it comes to consumer products, you're absolutely right. It's a different ballgame in that companies have a much larger user base to address. A, B, they don't have that much of an influence, unlike a company where you really have to follow your company's IT guidelines in order to be able to use those services and work in that company. A consumer can just walk away and not use your service if they find it too complex from a usability perspective. And part of usability ends up being that authentication experience. So we've seen that on the consumer side, a lot of companies that actually are very good in terms of their understanding of security and providing or lowering the bar, if you will, inadvertently in terms of how easy it is to push that remember me button or keep me signed in or allowing for weak passwords or not doing a good job of detecting when a user is logging in from a compromised machine. So there's definitely differences, definitely categorization. However, I can tell you that we're seeing fast convergence of the technologies that are being used to address both sectors, whether it's a B2E, B2C employee or business to business, or whether it's a direct-to-consumer side product. We're seeing that the technologies that are being adopted for authentication are quickly converging into saying, well, the employee also deserves a good level of convenience and the consumer deserves a high level of security.
Let me ask you about multi-factor versus multi-layer, because I think that is I hear more of the term multi-factor, but I liked your definition of multi-layer. Can you go into that just briefly?
Definitely. I mean, you may have been challenged with some type of authentication, and then 5 minutes later, or even within the same process, another part of the system that you're trying to access may now authenticate you again using the same method that was authenticated 5 minutes ago, or using a different method. That would multi-layered, and that different parts of the system or different parts of the solution that you're accessing may or may not honor a prior authentication that occurred by another part of the system. That would be multi-layered. Or they may up the process in terms of saying, yeah, you were authenticated for process A, but now when you're getting into process B, I'm going to require a different type of authentication. That would be multi-layered. Multi-factor is mainly for a process or for accessing a part of the system. Like the same part of the system, they say, in order to access information and services that I provide, you need to go through multiple types of authentication. So it's one process or one system versus multiple parts of the system that differentiates multi-factor versus multi-layered.
So you go back in time a bit and you go back to the old school methods, and I didn't quite know this, but you went back and looked at China, I guess in 200 BC. I guess handprints were used for evidence of burglary. And then
that's right.
I mean, that's amazing. And then I guess you were talking about in the UK, I guess in 1892, there was fingerprints for, can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. Finally, a huge amount of effort in terms of trying to find a unique identifier in terms of a claim that you claim to be, or identification, saying you are this individual because of a match, was achieved through basically establishing what we would call today points of interest or minutia. And in effect, that was achieved through finding points of interest on a fingerprint of a user, of a person, and finding that pattern and the points of interest on that fingerprint are quite unique to that individual. And so that has been now obviously perfected to the point that we are in 2015 seeing products like Apple's Touch ID or Samsung's S5 devices natively equipped with fingerprint sensors. It's interesting also that we've seen renditions of this from a points of interest perspective that are much more, which require a much higher number of points of interest across multiple fingers. For example, if you're fingerprinted at a terminal at the airport, basically you will see that multiple fingers on both hands get fingerprinted, and the matching requires a higher stringent matching algorithm in terms of number of points of interest and the accuracy for the matching. What you're seeing on smartphones and tablets requires a more user-friendly and less stringent subscription, in that a single finger swipe or a single touch is then matched. And if you look at how that matching is occurring, that you can actually put the tip of your fingerprint and it still matches you, I mean, that tells us that the number of points of interest probably lower in terms of what is being looked at. So we've seen different versions and implementations of, for example, the fingerprint alone, in terms of ones that are swipe-based, where you swipe your finger, touch-based, ones that can take into account the three-dimensional, basically, availability of a finger rather than just a flat print, ones that capture the data and match it against an exact match versus ones that store templates and perform matching based on those, device side, server side. And then there's also another distinction that has occurred in another type of evolution on biometric, specifically fingerprinting, that we've seen is going from basically pure identification, which is one where you would have a database of millions of fingerprints, and now, let's say, Bill provides his fingerprint, and now that fingerprint has to be matched against this millions of record database to see which one is Bill, as opposed to a claim that says, this is Bill, pull up Bill's record and see whether or not there's a match. And that's the difference between identification and verification. One is a little bit tougher to do in order for you to go through millions of records and see which print does this one match against, versus saying, Bill, somebody's claiming to be Bill. Let's see if that's true or not. We have a print of Bill's fingerprint, not a print of it, but a template or a series of points of interest, minutia. Does the new data that we just acquired from this person who's claiming to be Bill match what we have on file? And that would be more of a verification. So we've seen that transition as well. Sorry, go ahead.
How is that going to transition? Because that is fascinating. I remember 8-10 years ago at Burton Group conference, a gentleman from IBM talking about, and I know you've probably heard of him before, he's one of the identity guys, and talking about how he saw the need for an identity service provider that essentially was in the cloud that would hold the database of, I guess in your example, fingerprints. And
that's right.
And that someone would have to take on that risk, that liability to hold that database, and then everyone else. So if you go into Amazon to buy a book, that's different than Bill Murphy going into his corporate infrastructure to access services versus going to the bank to do a bank transaction. So do you envision that the systems will get that intelligent to be able to have a user-based user assertion and identity control?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say that view has been shared by nation states, not companies, in terms of collecting. I gave some examples, in fact, in that presentation, in terms of some of the bigger databases we've seen out there. One in the Aadhaar, basically database in India, which holds close to 800 million identities in the form of either fingerprint templates or iris or face. And second to that would be the one in the U.S., which holds close to 200 million templates and profiles of users who've come through the port or have been fingerprinted for whatever reason. So that approach makes sense at a national level. Having said that, I should tell you that after what we've been through as people in terms of compromises with passwords on servers, where a hacker gets access to a database of credentials and all of a sudden finds 200-300 million passwords and can use some decryption method to get access to them. If you imagine the same happening to fingerprints, the challenge there is that while your password is something you can change, your fingerprint is not something you can change. It's one that you were born with, and unless you're day labor, unless you age, or unless you're Southeast Asian female, then the chances of that fingerprint template changing are very little. And the reason I mentioned those exceptions is that part of the challenges with fingerprint biometrics is that parts of the population have a disposition against fingerprint sensing due to the patterns on their fingertips or the genetic makeup that prevents a good detection or a good matching of that.
There's a significant statistical part of the population that has some, either they're missing limbs or digits, or they're just cannot participate. Okay.
That's right. And then, so if you put that aside and we just look at the challenges we've been having in terms of every day we wake up and there's another breach and another vulnerability. So over the past, I would say, 3 or 4 years, and this is a fast-paced transition, I came to RSA through the acquisition of a company called Passman, which I had co-founded and started. And we were focused on server-side biometric authentication, amongst other methods of auth, but we were really focusing on face and voice, and then supporting some of the client-side methods that were emerging. Fast forward 3 years later, and that was 2012, in 2015, we are seeing that some of the bigger players in the market, companies like Apple, Google, Microsoft, and Samsung, are actually moving towards a device-side authentication model for biometrics. And one of the biggest proponents or cheerleaders for that, naturally, is all the service providers and banks and institutions and relying parties in general that you can name. Because if you think about it, this reduces the headache for them to having to manage tens of millions of credentials and in the form of biometric templates, acquiring that data, protecting that data, matching that data, transferring the templates encrypted over the wire, matching it and sending results back. would have been a complete, and we know that it would have been a very tough process to implement properly. So we're seeing a groundswell, more than a groundswell, we're seeing an adoption at a good scale of biometric authentication that occurs on the device. And you see good examples of that both on Touch ID and in terms of Samsung's efforts, but also upcoming Windows 10 devices where they're implementing native iris, fingerprint, and face detection as built-in sensors into the device so that at no time does your biometric template transmit or leave the device. The privacy is of utmost importance in terms of that privacy data, and what the message is that belongs to the user. So the user authenticates to the device. The device then makes an assertion that this is Bill. So as far as the service concerned, be it a banking service or a healthcare provider or the enterprise, you trust the device. You say, I trust this iPhone, I trust this Windows 10 device, I trust that Samsung or that Google Android device in that it's a managed device or a device that are registered to my services, and I know that it's equipped with a authenticator that can firmly assert the identity of the user, and from there I expect the device to do a really good job of protecting the user's biometric profiles. So in that sense, you move away from having to acquire, encrypt, transmit, match, send the result back over the wire to one where, first of all, identification becomes much easier because how many profiles do you think you have on a single phone? Maybe two. And also verification becomes much smarter and much more specialized. The other advantage that we've seen is that it reduces significantly the chance of man-in-the-middle and impersonation attacks because you can actually rely on the liveness detection and the detection of the sensors and identity of the device that the user had authenticated with, enrolled with originally. And the other advantage is that if a hacker hacks a server, they get nothing. There are no credentials now on the server. For them to pose the same attack, they would have to physically steal hundreds of millions of devices, get pristine copies of people's biometric profiles, hack into the 100 million devices, and get access to tamper-proof mini hardware security modules that these devices are not equipped with. It's just not practical.
Oh, I see. So you're saying that by pushing this out to the edge, you're essentially spreading out the surface and making it very, very difficult because now you're pushing the authentication down to the actual device itself.
Exactly. The other in parallel set of technology that you've seen now evolve into what is practically usable is a series of security elements, trusted execution environments, trusted protected modules that now exist on smartphones, tablets, laptops. And the meaning of all that is that the device is very much capable of doing a good job of protecting that biometric profile at rest when it resides on the device. And it can do a good job of processing the data acquisition and the verification process natively on the device. So these two go hand in hand. There's still a chance of, targeted attacks. You can still go find my phone, right, get a good copy of my fingerprint, turn it into a three-dimensional model, and impersonate me and be at the right location, and a lot of good stuff. So look at what you have to do now to basically impersonate me and hack into my services. You have to be A, in possession of my device, B, in possession of a pristine copy of my biometric sensors, and C, pass the risk assessment that should be accompanying this type of authentication.
This is completely fascinating because when your company, Passband, that was purchased by RSA, you guys had worked on the biometric pieces related to voice and face and eyes, right? Is that correct?
That's right.
On the server side.
That's right.
Now, so you're taking a lot of that, IP, and you're saying this can be done not only in the server side, which has been done, but it can be pushed out to the edge. And you're saying with Windows 10 and Samsung and Touch ID, and I'm sure Apple ID, or maybe Apple ID is Touch ID.
That's right.
That this same approach can be pushed down to the device. That's kind of what you're saying, right?
Exactly. In other words, it doesn't have to come from a single vendor. So instead of having to rely on a single vendor, you can actually rely on the innovation by a large community of device manufacturers and biometric providers to go hand in hand and come up with a device that in the hands of the user protects them and protects the services that they're using. So as I said, this is music to the ears of some of these service providers. They don't have to spend all that money now buying complex biometric technology server side, and B, frankly, they reduce or, let's say, move the liability of holding on to that sensitive data back to the user and saying, it's your device, you're in control of it, you hold your privacy in your hands in the form of the tablet or smartphone or laptop that you're using, and oh, by the way, your credentials are on your device. So do whatever is necessary, buy the best device, then connect to our service. And so that's one part of the trend in terms of, improve how we store and protect the data on the device, how we acquire the data, use more advanced methods on these devices. That's why we're very much looking forward to iris. If you think about it, one of the advantages we see in iris detection is that the impersonation in the form of basically liveness detection becomes less important because it's less likely and more difficult to impersonate somebody's iris than it is to impersonate somebody's face, voice, or fingerprint.
So in the order you go through voice and face and iris and heart and behavior and even ears, I remember you listed those. What is like most secure going down to least, and then can you combine those?
Absolutely, you can. In fact, we've worked on similar techniques in terms of having the user utter a phrase while they're looking into a camera. Now, if you imagine that's occurring while the user is looking at a lens and there's actually IR sensor in there that's doing iris detection, you're doing a combined multi-factor of multiple biometric methods. And if the user can't utter the phrase, or that the environment's too noisy, or you don't get a very good score on voice, but you get a phenomenal score on the iris side, then you can make a decision. And oh, by the way, you can combine that with the location of the user at the same time and with the risk associated with what they're about to do. So the context of what they're doing, their location, the trend in terms of what they've done before on that device, in terms of the service they're using, combined with, as you said, one or many biometric methods yields a good result. What we're really trying to advocate against is single-factor decision-making and saying, past fingerprint biometric, this is who they claim to be. We think that's dangerous because of what's very much possible in the form of impersonation, in the form of basically fooling the system through providing a template or a picture or a voice profile or a voice recording that sounds like the user that way. Now with iris, things become a lot more difficult in terms of impersonation, and you go from what it is in terms of points of interest in fingerprint sensors to probably 5 to 7 times that in terms of iris, and you go from what is today 1 out of 1 to 200,000 false acceptance rate on a fingerprint sensor to 1 out of 2 to 3 million false acceptance rates on iris. So it really changes the game from device authentication, both on the false acceptance rejection rate and in terms of the liveness detection that is necessary and very difficult to implement on fingerprint sensors.
Oh, so a fingerprint sensor can be, you said 1 in 200,000 false positive, but with an iris, it's 1 in 2 million. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. I mean, if you think about the number of points of interest on your eye and the fact that even identical twins don't share the same iris score, iris code, and it's just a different user experience. I should say that even though it yields better results, it requires a new sensor in the smartphones and laptops and devices that we use that doesn't exist today. So we're talking about a substantial overhaul of what we're using today. That's one side of it. And secondly, fingerprint enjoys one of the most important aspects of all this, which is usability. The fact that you're bound to use the fingerprint sensor at some point in your life, either at a bank or at a port of entry or on some laptop that you own in your company, or now with the way that Apple is commercialized that you've seen it on your smartphone or tablet. Whereas taking the phone, holding it close to an eye, or using that for iris detection is probably not as familiar to users. I'll give you another interesting example. A few years ago, when we were using these methods and we're putting it in front of users and asking them which one is more convenient for you, which one do you look forward to using on a day-to-day basis as a replacement for entering complex passwords to authenticate yourself, to identify yourself. And we found gesture to be very interesting. You just move the device, you do something that you would do anyway, like move the device the way that you would use it on a day-to-day basis, and the system would say, yep, I know that this is Bill because of the behavioral authentication or behavioral metrics that occurred, which matches the user's typical gesture and the typical way that you use this device. And Face, at that time, in 2012, had a creepy nuance to it, and that people didn't feel comfortable holding the phone in front of their eyes to take the picture. Well, what a difference time makes. 3 years later, selfie has become a verb and a noun, and we're just very, very familiar and very comfortable actually holding the phone in front of our eyes and taking pictures. So when we describe face verification, people say, oh, like a selfie. And yeah, that's exactly what it is. And now it's become much more commonplace and acceptable as an authentication method. So some of these, I think, methods will take time, both from a implementation and availability on the sensor and hardware level, technology, if you will, and secondly, usability, but lastly, not least of which would be acceptance by the users from a behavioral perspective.
That's the title of your new blog post, Keyvan, is going to be Selfie-Based Authentication.
I think people will feel that that's already been done because, like I said, as a cultural revolution, we've seen this become very, very popular. And now when we talk to people and show it, almost without an exception, they draw a parallel to selfies.
That is fascinating. And basically, do we hold phones now that are capable from a processing power point of view, or are you seeing this only in the next generation of hardware devices being able to support this? Or do you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think even today, a subset of devices that are out there are capable of the right hardware profile for protecting the data at rest on the device, and also in possession of the right type of sensors for face or blood vessel pattern or vein detection. Iris requires a whole different level of complexity in terms of the sensors and data collection. So I would say if you and I were having this conversation 3 to 5 years from now, we would be hard-pressed to find a user buying a device that is not equipped with the right sensors and the right protection modules, and that's going to be probably very much the case as we go into 2020. But as it sits today, people still use Windows XP, and they're still using devices that are a little bit older, and not everybody, especially not the older generation, looks forward to spending $500 every other quarter to buy the latest gadget. So I think with the adoption of BYOD and the fact that organizations rely pretty heavily on individuals to go and buy that next shiny gadget, that transformation is going to take time. And to your point, because it's not ubiquitously available on a large number of devices, it's going to take time. I think it's in the 3 to 5 year range based on what we're seeing in terms of activity amongst the key stakeholders, device vendors, operating system providers, security companies. It's moving fast, but we're not there yet.
What is this concept of liveness detection? So I know you mentioned protecting data at rest is dependent on the devices being kind of fully capable of doing that. What is this live-ness detection or spoofing to prevent spoofing? What is that?
Yeah, if you think of the selfie example I mentioned to you, if I am able to fool the system by holding a picture of Bill that I found on Facebook and bringing that in front of a computer and put it in front of my laptop, and the laptop thinks this is Bill and logs him in. And we've seen unfortunate instances of that in many of the most popular vendors you can imagine, that there's been YouTube videos that show that that's very easily possible and doable against the services that they offer. That is prevented using what is known as liveness detection. So if your voice password is I don't know, I love Skype, or whatever is your voice password. Somebody captures a recording of you saying that, and the quality is good enough for you to then hold that recording to the phone, and the phone thinks this is you uttering that phrase, then you fooled the voice biometric system, or in the case of the face, you fooled the face verification product, or in the case of fingerprint, if I lift your fingerprint off of a glass and I can make a 3D model, has been demonstrated very successfully, both on Android, Samsung, and Apple's device, I can impersonate you. So in order to prevent that, liveness detection says it was not just a replica or a snapshot or a copy of the person's biometric data that was provided to me as part of the data acquisition. I actually performed liveness detection. I made sure this was an actual living, breathing individual, in that they were able to blink, move their head, smile. Basically, they were able to, in the case of voice biometric, to match certain aspects of a person actually saying something as opposed to it being played back to a recorder or to an audio device. And it's been fascinating watching the innovation that some of the companies in this sector have made, to the point that it's very difficult actually to fool them to the way that you get a very, very low percentage of success, and you can only achieve that type of success in a lab environment. So yes, you can still pose the targeted attacks, but it's much more difficult to do that even in a lab environment.
So do you envision that RSA will be able to, what is really interesting for me, just from on the corporate side, just from a CIO that may have 1,000 users that have different mobile devices that are trying to access the environment, is there a way that RSA will be able to assert that the person is who they are, and then be able to, and these biometric pieces that we've been discussing, and take that into the enterprise and match that against an Active Directory user, so be able to combine those two elements together versus what it is currently right now, which is, like a token or some device that you hold. Is RSA kind of looking at that model for the future?
We're looking at exactly that. We're looking at multi-factor authentication. In fact, at RSA conference, we launched a solution called VIA. And VIA is one of the aspects of it, aside from single sign-on and federation and a lot of other good things around provisioning. Part of it is really defining those authentication policies, and that we're not prescribing one factor over the other. Because, as I just mentioned, this is so fluid and so much in transition that I think what instead RSA has done is created a framework that we say, look, out of the gate, we support a good list of 5 or 6 of these factors. And as more and more of these methods get tested by RSA and we find that they pass the type of security requirements that we have for the data at rest and transition, the strength of the authentication methods, the usability, acceptance and rejection rates, then we will include them into the product and we will recommend them to the customer. So our approach is very much a multi-factor recommendation in terms of saying, in fact, many of these clients may say, no, I don't want to use a biometric method whose key strength is equivalent to a 4-digit PIN. So still want to combine that under a risky scenario or under a specific environment. This request is coming from an iffy machine or from a unknown network, or the behavior of the user has not been typically to transfer $10,000 at 2 a.m. from some unknown location. So I'm going to ask for another form of authentication. I'm going to mix this with another factor. That's typically the type of requirement we're getting from the customers we're dealing with, which is mainly the enterprise.
After listening to you talk, that is would be a great win to have that capability. So I know we're mixing some of the current capabilities with some of the future, but it's exciting to know that that's where RSA is going.
I think that there's no other way. I mean, imagine that you're relying solely on a single factor and that factor gets compromised, or that you find that the user seems to be passing that one test, but that you find the user, and you don't take into consideration that this is the right user at the right place at the right time. And so I'll give you one example. This user, Joe, logs in to their network to access application A. And now imagine that same request comes in at 2 a.m. from the same office to access the same application. If you took the factors in isolation, right, the company says, I want Joe to have access to this application 724. I don't really, I just want him to have access. And office is a trusted location. And the user identified themselves. But if you put all that together, this user, Joe, has never logged into the system at 2 a.m. And oh, by the way, the time 2 a.m., he's never logged in at this time from this location to this application. So combining these factors together provides a different view of the risk associated with what's about to happen versus only taking into consideration that he passed the authentication as an end user. And that's why we think that ultimately multi-factor is the way to go, bringing in the risk element, bringing in the element of location, and then making a decision.
That's great. I appreciate, that makes perfect sense. Well, I wanted to just shift gears for a second. So you've been contributing to the security community for several years through companies that you've been an owner in. I know your company Passband was just purchased by RSA a couple years ago, and I know you've been involved and currently involved in other organizations as well. What are you most proud of from your work in the security community through the years, and what are you most proud of?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It's interesting just thinking about it. One interesting thought I should mention to you, if you and I were having this conversation 9 years ago, I was CEO and prior to that CTO of a company called Lightscape, and we were building, and that company's still up and running, by the way, building solutions for VoIP networks. So I don't know if you're familiar with these larger Cisco phones or the VoIP devices that became very popular in larger organizations as a means of making calls and joining conference calls and basically real-time communication. And one of the aspects of this device was that it provided what is known as enterprise mobility. So if you're working out of the head office or if you travel to some other office in the East Coast, you should be able to walk to any phone, identify yourself, and that phone should now have your phone number, missed calls, place calls, your voicemails, your applications on that phone should basically move with you. And the question was, how do you identify yourself? And at the time, it was protected with your 4-digit voicemail PIN, right, which is not secure at all. And so we ended up creating a device that sat next to the phone. You would walk to any phone and use your contactless identity card or use your fingerprint, swipe your fingerprint, or use a magnetic card strip and combine that with RSA's token to achieve multi-factor authentication. You would swipe your card, swipe your finger, the phone would automatically change right in front of your eyes and now possess your profile, like your persona would basically push to the phone. And it was fun to watch the reaction that we got from basically people we presented this to, where it wasn't just stronger and better than the entry with 4 or 5 digit PIN. It was actually much more convenient from the user's perspective, simply swiping a card or a fingerprint and achieving the same level of mobility. And obviously with that came a whole level of security that they can decide which phones and which services required what type of combination of factors. And I can say that at that time we evaluated same types of technologies that have been around for a very long time, face recognition or voice-based authentication. And what has been fun and very, very fascinating is really the speed of innovation that has occurred within the industry in terms of moving from what used to be a tinker toy to something that can be used today to actually authenticate and verify the identity of hundreds of millions of users in their day-to-day life and making it easier for them to identify themselves. I think that's been one of the highlights for me, is watching this transformation and participating, providing feedback to some of these vendors and working with them very closely to get to where I think seems to be a much better place from a user authentication perspective.
Well, we have a Cisco phone at our shop, and I've been involved in the whole voice over IP movement from its beginnings, and of course Cisco led the charge there. So I know very much what you're referring to, and that is, it's interesting because you've had this interesting career with mobility, which of course we spent a lot of our discussion talking about mobile phones, and the ability to know who you are on the device. It's just you've transitioned from phones that are static within an enterprise to more of a ubiquitous, essentially mobile phones. So it's interesting how your career has gone down a similar path, but kind of almost broadened in many respects.
Yeah, I mean, imagine how much of a surprise it would have been 10 years ago if somebody presented with a device that had a gyro accelerometer, a front camera equipped with 300 frame per second movement detection, a multiple sensors for microphone in terms of voice detection and location detection, GPS sensor, all in one device that actually fits in the palm of your hand. I mean, we would probably look at that and say, yeah, that's science fiction. And yet, 10 years later, I mean, it's just very, very commonplace, very affordable for the consumer. And in fact, it's so commonplace that organizations accept you bring it to work and saying that can be your main device. Again, another thing that probably 10 years ago would have been a completely unacceptable practice. You came in and they gave you a BlackBerry and that was it. You know, you had a choice between two different models of the same device. Not knocking BlackBerry, I'm a big fan of that device. But look at what we've come in terms of innovation and how much jam-packed and feature-packed these devices are to be acceptable, not only for personal use, but also for enterprise use, and now allowing us to mix strong authentication to identify users.
Well, I appreciate your answer to that question of what you're most proud of, because your contribution to the security community has been fantastic, and I've been fascinating having our discussion. And I'm sure our users are going to really appreciate your perspective. So I want to thank you for your time today. But before we go, is there a way that people can learn more about you, more about the organization you work with? What would you recommend?
You know, we started now a series of blogs speaking of security, and I'd be happy to provide a link. Basically, on the RSA site, a series of blogs we started, and it looks to be pretty fascinating. It looks to be fascinating in terms of the number of people who are going to be contributing to that. So it's going to be a good place to go and see and get some fresh perspectives on people that I'm working with as well.
Well, I'll provide that information on our show notes so that people can access that. Well, Kevin, thank you very much for your time today. Well, that wraps up today's episode with Keyvan Ali-Kani. I love understanding authentication, but it's interesting to go back into the past and see how to compare authentication to what the Chinese were doing in 200 BC versus what we were doing with Dalton in the late 1800s, all the way up through the Civil War and now, when we're looking at facial recognition and looking at moving from server-based authentication to a device-based authentication using gestures and voice recognition. Is completely fascinating to me. And I think as an IT security professional and as a key decision maker, understanding these trends can only help and build your pool of knowledge in your mind when you may need it. So I hope you enjoyed that show. And also, I want to say thank you to our sponsor, the CIO Scoreboard. The CIO Scoreboard is a tool built for CIOs to visualize and abstract out of their IT security programs the complexity so that decisions can be made. It is a tool meant for the CIO to sit in the middle and be able to manage their IT security programs so that a CEO and a board can look at data and they can look at visualization of a program, no different than the way one would look at a balance sheet or an income statement within finance. Is the CIO Scoreboard puts the security program in a context and in a framework very similar to finance, and it develops a nomenclature. It develops a way of talking to the business that is a framework, no different than a financial framework. In an organization, this is a security framework that is friendly to the business and is not just cordoned off and only useful for auditors. So with that, I want to thank the CIOscoreboard.com. Also, if you are interested in the CIO mastermind groups that I've been running for almost 20 years now, please text me at 410-320-6433, 410-320-6433, and I'd be happy to put you on the list for the next CIO mastermind. We do about 2 of these per month for various size organizations, in groups of 5 to 6. And look forward to seeing you and talking to you on the next episode. Have a good day. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.